Hey, welcome into the Husker247 HoopsCast. I'm Mike Schaefer, joined by Brian Christopherson. And Brian, I don't know that I expected this result. I didn't know how it was going to play out for Nebraska as they got deeper into February and the wins became a little bit more difficult. But I don't know that I ever envisioned the 5 straight losses to end the regular season, miss a Big Ten tournament scenario, even going into Sunday's game, where I thought it was more of a toss-up than a guarantee that Nebraska would certainly win. But I just didn't really think that they would end up losing 5 straight. And I mean, they lost 6 straight earlier in the year, so obviously not smart by me to assume that they couldn't do that. But here we are. Nebraska loses again on Sunday. I don't even remember what the final score was. Do you have that
83 to 68.
83-68, a 15-point loss at home. Worst home loss of the year, I believe. For the most part, they had been inside single digits. I think every other conference loss that they had taken so far at home. Worst home loss of the year comes on senior night. Probably the worst production from Brice all year. I don't think it was his worst game because he did some other stuff besides scoring, but not the kind of senior night performance that you want. But the lasting image for me, Brian, was Juwan Gary just walking off the court, and it looked like everything hit him all at once. And the fans gave him a nice ovation. But in the portal era, a guy who plays 3 years at Nebraska, that might be as long as you get for anybody that's not Sam Hoiberg right now for how things are kind of playing out. And so Jawan wanted it as much as anybody. He came back, took less money than he would have gotten in the transfer portal, and Nebraska's season ends far short of where Jawan or any of those guys would have wanted.
Yeah, sad for those guys because I think Jawan's really proud to call himself he said this on Saturday, a Cornhusker, and him and Bryce both came back. I think last year and just feeling what it's like to have that ride like in Minneapolis at the Big Ten tournament, even though they got beat in the semis, it was still fun and they were in the middle of it. And they're kind of a talking point in college basketball. Then you go to Memphis and you see the support and you can see this fan base just wants to erupt around it. They both came back with the intentions like, let's do that and then some, and so it's been building to this moment, but when he left the floor with a minute 40 or whatever was left, it was the period at the end of the sentence that wasn't going to happen. And so it was a mission that didn't come to completion there. They're going to be remembered fondly, both those guys, by this fan base. We'll see on Tuesday where Brice falls in the all Big Ten teams. I still think he could be first team, with the string of games he had. And if you look at the totality of his season, I thought Iowa did a great job switching up its defenses on him and made it difficult for him to get comfortable. Dared some other guys to beat him, and nobody could. Sejan was 0 for 8 from 3, and Hoiberg shot 7 from behind the arc, hit 2. But, he took more shots than he normally does. So it was kind of a strange game. And I don't know about you, Schaefer. I never felt real good about it. I mean, Nebraska did start with that lead. It was 18-10, but then once Iowa had that 11-0 run, and it's not just because Nebraska was down, by a little bit. It just didn't feel like there was a belief, like even in PBA, that it was going to happen, did it? I mean, it was kind of a subdued crowd, and I don't blame the crowd at all. Don't get me wrong, but it was just kind of a quiet, like, this isn't going to work, is it? Like the mojo in PBA had been lost at this point, and you kind of sensed it.
There was a point early in the game. Nebraska's up 8 points. I think it was like 18-10. And they go up 18-10, and then Iowa goes easy layup 3-pointer. It gets to like 18-15, and then you just kind of knew at that point Nebraska was going to be in one of their sort of games that you expected. It was just going to be back and forth. They probably weren't going to pull out in front, and it felt like Iowa matched anytime Nebraska did anything. Nebraska hit a 3, Iowa hit a 3. Nebraska had a nice drive layup and scored. Iowa came down and hit another 3. It did not feel like the sort of game flow where Nebraska was turning over Iowa, getting them out of sync, making them uncomfortable. And because of that, you didn't know that there was really going to be much of a run for Nebraska. I think putting together 3-4 possessions in a row where they score is hard for this team. And you had a lot of those dumb moments that seemed to have popped up throughout most of the second half of the season. Brice is coming around to get a pass from I believe it was Burke, and he slips. The ball just flies right off of his shoulder and goes straight out into center court, and they run down, and I think Hoiberg fouled him, so he didn't quite get the dunk. But it was just that kind of day for Nebraska. It didn't seem like stuff was going to go its way, and that's unfortunate because I think they hit 3 out of their first 4 3-pointers. Juwan had the scramble 3-pointer at the end of the shot clock to start the scoring. Jawan was in the 20s with his points. And the thing is, Nebraska got looks. Like the whole season, we can get into as many conversations we want about Nebraska's defense or that it's a flawed team or whatever it was. They just didn't make enough open shots. I mean, you watched all of these games. You watched all of these games. And it wasn't like Nebraska had to like shoot over treetops to get 3-point looks. Teams were more than happy to give them to them. Connor Essegian flied around screens all year long, and I don't care whatever his 3-point percentage says it is. I know it took a big hit yesterday, but at one point he was in the 40s, and it never felt like that in conference play. He'd have these bubble games where he had a really nice game against Penn State, but for the most part, it just didn't feel like if you had to have it, he was going to come through. And even with Bryce, at times against Iowa, he had good looks and the ball just wouldn't stay down. And ultimately, I feel like Nebraska's season summed up by the fact that it didn't hit enough open shots and other teams hit big shots. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it goes in basketball. I mean, you can do everything right and put yourself in position, but if you can't put the ball through the hoop, you're not going to win enough. And that's where we are.
Yep. I was looking at the numbers. A lot of them are actually pretty similar. Offensive this year compared to last year. But the one that Hoiberg brought up, and it's what you're hitting on, is Nebraska made 225 threes this year. They made 319 last year. Obviously, They played a few more games, right. But they hit 35.7% last year. They hit 32.5% this year. Some people might be surprised. Like Casey was 76 of 202. That comes to 37.6. Essegian, also 37.6. I'm trying to find it. 70 of 186. So he had the same numbers, but where the big difference is, and this is what I wrote, and I don't think I did it too artfully yesterday right after the game. My mind was a little scrambled. But last year's team doesn't have to be the perfect summation of what you want to be or definition of it. I'm not saying that, but they had those options where I remember at one point last season, I wrote like, who was the leading scorer last season amongst the 10 home game wins they had in the Big Ten Conference? And it was like 7 different guys led in scoring amongst those 10 wins. So it could be a deal where like Essegian, like last year, if he had been on the team, could have gone 0 for 7. But maybe CJ Wilcher happened to be 4 for 6 that day. And Jamarcus Lawrence had the game at Indiana last year where he, so it was like, you need to have those options where you're not saying this guy is a perennial scorer or anything, but 2 or 3 times a year, you have enough of it's spread out where that guy could go off and lead you on a given night, this guy on that night. And I felt like Nebraska only had like 3 guys, maybe like that, and so people like, I know get fired up because when Essegian has a bad game, I understand that because the focal points on him, but it's almost like there is too much weight like that. He had to be really great because there were no other shooters in a way. And I'm sure he's disappointed with yesterday's game, and it is a bummer and all that. But that's a thing. Like I want Connor Essegian back on this team next year. I want more of him. I want him multiplied. That's what I would say about it. And then looking at these numbers, Schaefer, last year, Rink Mast, who I hope comes back, he's been loyal, staying here, and Nebraska's been loyal to him with the surgery and all that. Mast was 42 of 122 from 3. Burke was the best big they had from 3, actually, with 22 of 77.
It's not as bad as I thought it was going to be, but it's not good.
But Mass had 20 more threes, and you just know that like Mass had the game against Ohio State where he went off and hit everything. And so it was on tape that like teams had to respect that. And I will always say amongst that team last year, and I'm using this to move it forward, Mass was the most important guy because he spread the floor and he helped make Hoiberg's offense look so pretty because it wasn't all they couldn't clog the paint. You know, they couldn't necessarily dare Nebraska just to beat him from the outside. Like Casey could do back cuts, and that's how he averaged 5 more points a game than Esijan did this year, despite similar 3-point numbers. So I think Mass, you talk about portal additions and where they go from here. Well, I mean, start with get that guy to play one more season. Esijan, yes. And then they're going to have to nail it in 2 weeks. The portal opens up, and everybody's going to be complaining about what was, and for fair reason. But they've got to get busy, and they got to hit at a high clip and put the pieces together well. It's just disappointing though. 12-2 team, on January 7th, up 15 with 15 left against Iowa, and then what we get here at the end.
Yeah, that's it's a tough pill to swallow. All right, so I want to get into kind of like the look ahead stuff, but before we get there, there's a couple things I want to get to. Do you think Nebraska basketball 24-25 iteration has played its last game?
No, I don't. I mean, Hoiberg has been pretty, forceful about like, well, yeah, there's still more ball for this team, and it seems like that could be the Crown Basketball Classic out in Las Vegas. They I think are trying to take like 2 power conference teams that have the highest net that weren't in the tournament, and so Nebraska probably falls in that category. So it's kind of an interesting tournament. I'm intrigued to see how much Husker fans are into it after getting a taste of the real enchilada last year. And I just sense like the mood is so down. I don't know how fired up people are going to be for it. But if the guys want to play in it and it doesn't distract from the portal mission, which I think they already have done their homework and know some of the guys they want to target, that's just the way the era we're in. Hoiberg said as much in the post game. Then sure, go play it. I don't think it makes a difference one way or another.
All right. And so then that's out of the way. I want to spend a couple minutes talking about Brice and Jawan and, any of the other seniors if you want to discuss them as well, but specifically Brice and Jawan. Brian, you've been covering this team for a few years now. You've covered essentially Jawan's whole career at Nebraska, right?
Yeah.
And certainly Brice's 2 years at Nebraska. Just what are your thoughts as someone who's been over there, been at the press conferences, you were at practices, you're more clued in as to who these guys are. And it's not like you ate meals with them and you spend a ton of time with them, but you have a better sense of who they are and what they brought to Nebraska. And so I just want to give you a few minutes to kind of talk about each of Brice and Jawan and what Nebraska's losing, because I think these are pretty unique and special players. And I don't know that it's going to be easily replaced. Like it's not a stat line so much that Nebraska is replacing with Brice or Juwan, and they put up numbers, so they're going to have to replace numbers. But I think their combined personalities, their willingness to seed last year at times or take over when they needed to, I thought was really kind of a key thing in that 23-24 team. And then certainly the competitive fire of Bryce Williams, I don't think will ever be on more display than what we saw in that Ohio State double overtime game, where specifically in overtime, he kind of had taken things over and Nebraska just couldn't finish that game out.
Yeah. And it's good to remind that when Nebraska picked up Bryce out of the portal 2 years ago, he remember he had that like impressive finish in like the CBI tournament for Charlotte, but he'd been kind of injured and he was not like the highest on the rankings. Like, so that, I mean, that's a reminder as we go into this next phase that there are guys like him out there. If you really do your research, and it might not get the acclaim right off the bat, but I think it was known once he stepped on campus that he could arguably be the best guy on the team right away, or he was right up there. And you saw it sort of building. Like the thing I remember most was at the end of last year, like in the Big Ten tournament and the NCAAs. It was like Brice was at another level. Like you could see that he was had really transformed into, if he had to score, he could go score for him. And he was, he didn't necessarily have to wear that hat all the time with last year's team. But when he had to, you saw that, okay, that's in his bag. And I just thought he was always a classy player. He was a smooth player, like the mid-range jumper you don't see as
Oh,
much. And he has like one of the more pure mid-range shots like that you
let
see
me
in.
let me cut you off here because you said something that stands out to me, and you've watched a lot of Nebraska basketball. We obviously do the dumb guess a random Husker Hooper game. Bryce's jump shot, his mid-range jump shot, might be, as you said, smooth, pretty. It might be the most aesthetically pleasing of any Nebraska basketball player that I have watched in close to 30 years or so, whatever, like 25 years. I mean, I don't remember the great teams of the 90s. So, but I don't. Teron Lue didn't have that kind of jump shot. Like, I mean, that's kind of where things start for me. Kerry Cohorn was a great 3-point shooter. Brian Conklin, great 3-point shooter. They had guys who could shoot from outside, but like his ability to get to the elbow and then what it looked like when he went up and how often he could hit that shot. I think only James Palmer is in the category for me of guys who shot the way that Brice did. Am I off my rocker here? Is there anybody I'm forgetting?
No, he's up there when you're talking about like the 15-footer to 18-footer.
Yeah.
And when you're comparing guys, I mean, different eras, that shot was more prevalent in the game than it is now. You just don't see it as much anymore because everybody, it's either three or, in the paint. And sometimes it's considered a bad shot. Like the opposition wants you to shoot, the 17-footer because it's only 2 and it's a tougher shot. Got a lot of guys can't hit it, but Brice made it count. And getting choked up talking about it. You're gonna have to finish up. Got something in my throat, but
Yeah, I mean, for me, Bryce just being a 3-level scorer is not something I've seen a lot at Nebraska. I've seen him have some big guys who have had some success right around the rim. Obviously, we've seen some unique 3-point shooters who can hang out in the corner, or Tominaga who did things in different ways, but I wouldn't call him a 3-level scorer. Brice could get to the rim on his own, could stop on the way to the rim, pull up for a jump shot, and nail it from, as you said, 18 feet. And then he could come off of screens or pull up off the dribble and hit 3-pointers. I mean, it's like Teran Petaway was a super unique player, but he wasn't as smooth of a jump shooter. James Palmer was a really unique player and wasn't as smooth, I think, overall as Brice was. Brice has his faults. I mean, he really couldn't go left with the dribble. He wasn't a great ball handler, but he got asked in a role that I don't know suited him the best to do it. And I just like, it's one thing when we talk about his statistical production. It's another thing about how he sort of made everyone else on the team better, both last year and this year, by entirely different ways. I mean, last year he was an option, but he didn't have to be the option. This year he was the option and often could come up big for Nebraska. And so, again, I just think it's going to be really tough to replace that.
What hurts so much is this is an 18-team league, and he might be first team All Big Ten, and they're not going to go dancing with that guy.
Well, they didn't even make the Big Ten tournament with that guy. Like
Yeah.
I can handle Nebraska being on the bubble when your bubble bursts. The fact that they couldn't find one more win on their schedule to get to the Big Ten tournament with this team and with the resume that they had put together going into that 5-game losing streak just feels so incredibly damning. And then you go through the way they lost all 5 of those games, and it's bookend by 2 double-digit losses in Penn State and Iowa, but those 3 losses in the middle there, I mean, I don't know that I've seen a 3-game stretch like we saw with Michigan, Minnesota, and Ohio State, where you get both ends of the spectrum scoring-wise in the Michigan and the Ohio State game. You've got a double overtime game in there, and then you get your absolute heart ripped out and stomped on by Brennan Rigsby of Minnesota. Yeah. And to not make the Big Ten tournament with a guy like Brice, with this roster, it shows you how deep the league is. It shows you how hard it is to win games. But, man, that has to just burn everybody over there.
Yep. And, I mean, use Sunday as the example. Iowa's obviously pretty mediocre team.
They're
Barely
a bad
gets in.
team. They're a
Yeah,
bad team with a couple shooters. And Dix is a better athlete than I ever give him credit for. He made some moves yesterday.
yeah. But I mean, the difference though, and as much as I kind of hate the modern game where it's like so just 3-point prevalent, you have to have it. You do. And Iowa, like yesterday, you're like, okay, they got like 4 guys who at any given time he could knock down 2 in a row, and you just don't feel that about Nebraska. And so Iowa made 5 more 3-pointers. They shot about the same amount. Nebraska hits 6 of 27. Iowa hits 11 of 28, and there you go. So that's just one example. Back to our first point of what did in this team is you make 2 less 3-pointers per game on average. Add up those points. I mean, hit 2 more in like 2 more games, and we're having a different story, right? Right now we're talking about who they're going to play and all this. So the margin is that thin, but that's where, again, you have to have a diversity of options on your team where you feel like this guy's cold today. This guy over here can pick it up for you. And it just didn't feel like Nebraska had enough of those.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add on Jawan?
Yeah,
Before
Jawan.
we kind of kick this forward?
I don't know which game you remember the most from Jawan, but the one that comes to my mind is Kansas State last year when he had just that massive rebounding performance. It was the same day, unfortunately, the volleyball team lost in the tie. So all of the Husker fan base's attention was sort of diverted over there. And then Nebraska picks up this road win where Jawan's just a monster. And even though the Husker Nation was sad, I remember driving home from Manhattan thinking, these guys are going to be able to do it. And one of the reasons is Jawan's that junkyard dog, like he's got enough of that bark in him that he's going to help this team get over the hump. And I'll always remember that game. And when I looked out, and we used to make jokes about Bryce's beard, like he, looks like a grown man out there against the boys. But that was a game that always stood out to me where it's like, man, they got some on certain nights, Brice and Jawan look like they're the varsity and the other kids are the JV. And that was one of those examples. And when that happened, when those two put it together at the same time, it was a lot of fun. And just wish it would have happened 1 or 2 more times this year. And we'd be getting the story we kind of want.
Yeah, I think that one definitely stands out as well because Nebraska really needed it. And I think that was right in the middle where Rink's knee first kind of was starting to have some issues. And so his rebounding wasn't going to be as strong. And Nebraska wasn't as big front court wise last year as they were this year. And so you needed Juwan to go up and get those rebounds. That's a great example of sort of what he brought to the table. I always kind of view Juwan, and this is probably a weird comparison and statistically doesn't bear out, but they reminded me a lot of each other. He reminded me a lot of Ade Dagandero. You remember him in the 2007 to 2009 range of Nebraska basketball, where it's this kind of swing forward who can do a variety of different things, but he always is willing to do the dirty work. Like he's always willing to, go up for the rebounds or to close out or to scramble on defense and can hustle down the court and is kind of this long-limbed athlete that plays a little bit bigger than he is and is a little faster than you think, but isn't particularly like the thing about Gary and the thing about a guy like Gary or Dagandero or whoever, there's not like one specific skill where you're like, this guy is great at this, but he's just kind of well-rounded at everything. I mean, Jawan made himself into a 3-point shooter. If you remember kind of what he looked like that first year, and then we saw him yesterday on senior night splash those early 2 3-pointers. He had that huge rainbow arc shot. It's a guy that, again, it's hard to replace. Like the stats are hard enough to replace, but he felt like a lot of ways the emotional leader of this team, the kind of heartbeat for the Nebraska basketball program. And so it's going to be really tough, I think, to kind of find someone to replace everything that he sort of did for you.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a very, very nice 3-year stretch here at Nebraska. The first interrupted with that injury that allowed for this last season, but he was really valuable, and it's unfortunate that senior night kind of went the way that it did for him.
In the moment, It really stinks how this season ended, but you think about like our little game where we talk about former Huskers. I mean, those are two names here, Brice and Jawan, that they're going to be near the top of the list for
Yeah.
kids of a certain age that were 12 to 24 in that range. When they get 20 years older and they take over podcasts like this, those are gonna be names they
We're gonna have it
pull.
right now. We will sell them this podcast right now.
Yeah, in the
Check
year
your allowance, folks.
2033, after Nebraska's made 4 straight Elite Eight runs, you can have this podcast. But yeah, I mean, those are guys who are gonna their name is gonna hang around Husker basketball for good reason, and they were here as bad as this is where it really stinks, Schaefer, is they finished with this losing skid at home, and one of the most memorable parts of the middle of their tenure here was just like how they would not be defeated in PBA and some of the plays
PBA
they
magic.
made. And like you think of games, like great games, some of the best Husker games I've seen in my whole life were in the last year in particular. But Jawan Gary, like I can think of moments where he goes up and like one hands a board with like 2 minutes left when the crowd's going nuts and it's building and it's like they're gonna do it. And he had those kind of plays that sort of put the exclamation point on it. With Bryce, I think it was against Purdue. This game is worth mention. That was the game he was sick, if I believe. He woke up sick last year.
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up having like a triple double or near it, and had swatted Edie from behind.
Yeah.
With late in that game, and so they had those kind of signature plays that were in a year and a half. That was a really fun period of Husker basketball, as bleak as the last
Right.
bit has been.
Right. And I don't know that there's a better way to kind of kick it forward to. There's obviously the conversation out there. It's on our message board. I've been asked about it on radio shows. I haven't talked with that many people in person that feel like Nebraska needs to move on. We haven't really touched on it a lot, but I see no way that Fred Hoiberg isn't Nebraska's coach next year. Like I don't see a scenario short of, I guess, he gets some sort of dream job, which I don't even know what that would be at this point in his career, that he's not coaching his kid in his final year at Nebraska, and he's Nebraska's head coach again. And I'll be honest, I think they're going to be middle of the pack. I think that's what Fred Hoiberg can bring to the table, which that may not sound super exciting, but how many years, like how many of those players, when we talk about former Nebraska players, never played in games that were as big as what Nebraska had in the last 2 seasons? I mean, if this is the future moving forward where you're perennially a bubble team, that's a hell of a lot better than the previous, however many years that came before it. So I don't think Fred Hoiberg's going anywhere. I suspect that you don't either.
No, I mean, both parts can be true. I can appreciate like this Husker fan base that this, I should add, the wrestling program, amazing year under Mark Manning,
Right.
finishing second in the Big Ten. But I do think sometimes people lump in like baseball, basketball, football, and people feel like even with last year's success in hoops, they really wanted that follow up year to it. Like let's get a string of things going. And when that didn't happen, I understand the disappointment. Like we felt it a week ago when Nebraska lost to Minnesota. Baseball team, I know they're playing LSU, but blows the lead.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just like right now, it's like, come on, dudes. Like you're just like the men's programs, wrestling aside, you got to step up and start like delivering some of those magical moments. And so I get that the frustration, and there's so much passion for it. It's like, why can't Nebraska, get on a run? But it has not, annually been a great basketball program. It's not an easy job, I don't think, by any means, for the reasons you laid out in the league that the Huskers are in. And the bottom line is, I don't suspect it's a real conversation about Fred's status. And so I always come back to that. At some point, it doesn't really matter what you or your neighbor thinks. It's what do people who matter think. Is this actually something that's moving down the road or is out there? And I don't sense that at all, as far as his status for next year or anything like that. And so that's why I kind of and pushing it forward with the stuff we write about. Like they got to have a huge portal cycle, and they got to get the right fit in here, because there is pressure to win next year, because people will expect it to get better. But right now, I think that opportunity is fully in front of Hoiberg and whoever he wants on his staff to be the guys who try to get that done.
I agree. I couldn't say it any better than you just did there. So I anticipate, that's the group that they're going to have moving forward. Frankly, Brian, like, I don't even think that there's going to be, and you never know who's going to have opportunities to go where, but I kind of like the staff that they have. It just came down to you need guys to hit open looks that were there, and they have to be able to get the guys and put them on the roster. That's their job too. But, I think the middle of this podcast where we're talking about Brice Williams and Juwan Gary, two players that I don't know that when Nebraska went and plucked them out of the portal were being discussed in the vein of which they're being discussed now on having just finished their careers or their last Husker home game. And so they can go get those guys. Like, I think they can find those players. And I think Fred Hoiberg knows more about basketball than our two heads combined or most of the listening audience combined. And so I tend to just believe that they can continue to make this look more like the last 2 years and a lot less like the first couple years that he had here. And so, and I'm really intrigued about the idea of Rink Mast and Connor Essegian and Sam Hoiberg and what you can fill around it. I anticipate, regardless of how people feel about him, that Burke could be back next year for Nebraska, and that gives you another front court guy. He gets an off season where you hope that you can kind of maximize conditioning and time in the gym, and he comes out in great shape. And it's a guy that at moments this year could have been a better player than he possibly ended up with. And maybe if he doesn't have that ankle injury at the end of a Ohio State game, things could have played out a little bit differently for Nebraska. But ultimately, they had who they had, and they just didn't make enough shots. Next year, try to find those 2 extra 3-pointers a game.
Yeah, and I do think you need at that point guard position that element of a better finisher. And I don't want to knock.
Give me UNO's JJ White. Can they just reach down there? I know it's a big jump from the Summit to the Big Ten, and I know that he is not the biggest player, but I'm not sure if you watched when they played on St. Thomas last night or had caught them before, Brian, but I am desperate for a facilitator that can get you in and out of your offense, that can play some solid defense, that has the ability to shoot from the outside. JJ White would be a dream to me in this scenario. And I don't think he's going to be staying at UNO for his last year.
How big is he?
He's, I think, right around 6 foot, 6'1", just going off of a guess and having seen him in person up close. But and if not JJ White, and it's probably not likely going to be JJ White, give me someone in that vein. Like I think it's as important, even with point center Rink Mast possibly coming back, that you go get a real point guard that can help you kind of facilitate things. And I think the return of Rink Mast could be really, really big for Nebraska. And then Connor Essegian can play off of that, and they could have a really nice 2-man game there. But I would love to see Nebraska go get an actual point guard.
Well, we'll see what happens. I know the Huskers have some stuff in the frying pan with some Italians too, so we'll see what happens. There's a story on our Husker247 right now. People can read about that, but yeah, it'll be interesting to follow it. And I am pretty sure the research has been put in. It's like a year-round process of like who could be on your next roster, I think, and like who might go in the portal. He's definitely going in the portal. Obviously, that stuff can't become public until March 24th, but I do think this Husker staff has been, it sounds like, on the ball with that. And that's why I don't suspect, as the big conversations that are out there, that's why I don't put much into them, because I think the staff's just proceeding like, got to go nail it now. Like, and that's going to be the mission here in the next couple months to put together a roster that does get you those 2 or 3 extra wins and has us having fun conversations right now.
Hey, before we go, what can you tell us about the 2 guys that redshirted, and Nick Janowski and Braden Frager?
Yeah, Yeah, you know what? Not a lot. I mean, Janowski obviously was a great scorer in his high school days, and I think has been working on his shot a lot. But I don't know if he's like, is he ready to come in and contribute? I think Frager, they saw the long-term potential in him and knew that there was going to be some development time, but he's really added some mass to his body. He took it seriously about becoming a bigger kid. And I have to say, I'm kind of excited to see like what he looks like, by the time we get to the fall and after some summer action. So I think that's going to tell us a lot. I don't know, like, if we'll get any, um, great updates or if they'll play anybody in the summer where you get a taste of it. But I'm watching Frager closely because I do think there's a long term possibility that he could be a really good player. But I don't want to put too much on him. I know those guys still have their work to do.
Any chance that he could come out looking like Isaiah Roby after his redshirt year, where he just is a, toy action figure with veins that you
Yeah.
can see inside the traps of his neck and all of that?
Yeah, I
Because
don't know
that
if
was
that.
maybe the most amazing redshirt physical transformation that anyone's ever had. So could we get that again, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, you never know. I don't think a lot of people actually knew the before and after, the picture of him with the before and after, so they might not be as impressed as they were with Roby, even if he pulls it off. But yeah, you hope at least one of those guys can be like knocking on the rotation next year. I mean, it's sort of, we're in that era. You hate it, but we're in that era of college basketball where you kind of get like a couple years to show you can knock the door down. Otherwise, you shift your thinking or the player shifts his thinking, which could happen. So we'll see. I know Janowski's always out there. I appreciate this about him. I'm writing up in the little press area, and he's always out there shooting after games, getting extra shots in. And I'll wait to tell the story for when he does some stuff, but he replays a specific shot from a certain March Madness memory and doesn't leave until he hits it. So it's kind of a fun thing to watch.
Maybe the most universal thing about being a kid in March Madness and basketball is there's always this one shot that sticks with you forever. For
Yeah.
me, it's I got to see the Bryce Drew Valparaiso one, and that was great. Do you remember the Drew Nicholas shot that beat UNC Wilmington?
Yep. In the corner.
That's always the one that I would go mess around at the YMCA or after it happened, running outside, putting the lights on at 10 o'clock at night on a Friday with a buddy on the basketball hoop in the driveway that's slanted, just trying to run and hit the three-pointer, the Drew Nicholas shot. That's the one that always stands out for me. So I'm excited to know what the Janowski one is.
Did you announce your shot, like, the seconds ticking down and stuff as you did it?
Yeah, I mean, I usually it'd be like me and the other guy, and we would just take turns trying to reenact it. And I don't know why I referred to him as the other guy, my friend Nathan. And one of us would be counting, and the other one would like flip the ball out in front of him and try to get behind it. And Nicholas had like such a unique body positioning as he's kind of turning. And if those watching on the video, I have my hands up like I'm going to reenact it. I don't know. I'm not going to do that, but he turns and he shoots it, and it was just awesome in the moment of watching that. And I'm like, oh man, Maryland's going to go on a run. I'm pretty sure they lost the next game, but I think that was a year after the national title.
I think so too.
For Maryland, because I love those Maryland teams. I was a very, very big fan of the Terps when Nebraska basketball wasn't on the screen as a kid.
I love teams like that. It was the year after because I remember, because I happen to have an affinity for teams that won the championship and they don't quite have the same material the next year, but they have like a couple pieces still left. And they're trying to hang on to get to like the Sweet 16 and protect the belt. Like, I love those teams. And that was one of them. Like Arkansas, Nolan Richardson in the 90s, they went all the way to the final somehow. They were like on the ropes every week game in the tournament.
Like Darvin Ham or Corliss Williamson.
Yeah. So I dig those kind of teams. But yeah, I remember that shot. The other one that I was replayed when I was a kid was Tyus Edney going coast to coast in like 5 seconds to beat Missouri in the second round. UCLA ends up winning the national title. But anyway, there's your walk down memory lane.
Yeah, well, maybe for March Madness, we'll just do a March Madness Memories podcast.
There you go.
And they can just be picking random moments and games to talk about that people can be like, I remember that. I know where I was when Mike Miller beat Butler. I remember that. So, yeah, we're coming up on absolutely two of my favorite days of the year, the Thursday, Friday. It's a shame that, unlike last year in Nebraska, unfortunately, will not be participating. So now that I've ended things on a sad note, I invite you to join us at Husker247.com, where there's always rays of sunshine and there's never clouds of gray. That's not really true, but we got plenty of content for you as you get through kind of a lean time now. You got Nebraska baseball, who managed to salvage the last game of this series against Washington, and we've got spring football starting. Matt Rule talks on Tuesday, so we'll have plenty of coverage of that. Recruiting is always going on. You can find all of that at Husker247.com.